There's certain things that some kids may have only ever experienced a limited number of times. Maybe some vacations, schoolyard romance, getting pantsed in front of the entire PE class, or playing specific video games a limited number of times because you never actually own them. For a lot of us, we had access to far less games as kids than we do now as adults. So if we played a game as a kid, whether we owned it or not, it was bound to make an impression. Plus, in general, kids are just very impressionable. In fact, quick little story for you, and this story's about Eddie. That's right, we're talking about Eddie again, for those of you that remember, and the story of Eddie goes like this. So I would go over to my neighbor's house to play video games quite often, and every once in a while, Eddie would be there, and Eddie wasn't very well liked. He was just your classic case of having a bad attitude, and he wasn't nice to anyone. So what Eddie would like to do is bring over some of his Nintendo 64 games, as well as his yellow Nintendo 64 controller. And the thing about Eddie's yellow Nintendo 64 controller is that nobody used it except for Eddie. You could be sure of that. And what he liked to do was either show off how good he was at one of the games that he brought over, while you watched, of course, or if he did let you play, it was so that he could absolutely dominate you at it. So War Gods is a fighting game, so he would absolutely mop the floor with us. Even though the reason was obviously because he had clearly played the game for hours on end, and we were just playing it for the first time, but you'd never know that by the way he acted, because he pretended like he was some sort of gaming prodigy for being able to beat us so badly at the game. Well, one day my friend had had enough, and keeping in mind that my friend was a very soft-spoken, small little kid, he looked at Eddie and he said, "Eddie, you're a nerd." And initially Eddie didn't respond, but as I looked at Eddie, clearly there was something going on. Eddie's eyes were full of hate. And then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Eddie exploded. He started slamming stuff on the ground, flipping around in circles in the room, and he yelled out, "Auntie Diane, Brian called me a nerd." And Aunt Diane came in and she said, "Well, Eddie, were you being a nerd?" And we looked around like, what even is a nerd? I don't know, but it sounds about right to us. But as a result, to this day, I still have a very certain fondness for the yellow Nintendo 64 controller, courtesy of Eddie, the word nerd, courtesy of Eddie being called that, as well as War Gods, although I don't own it and I would never play it, but you can bet I sure do remember that game. It was a game that I played but never owned, and when it comes to those games that you never owned yourself but you played it somewhere, usually that somewhere is something that you're gonna remember because it's part of the unique circumstances where you actually did have the chance to play that game. So it's gonna remind you of whoever it was you played it with, or wherever it was that you played it with, or what happened around it. So in my case, War Gods reminds me of Eddie. Of course, there were still ways to play a game without owning it in the comfort of your own home, and that would be with video game rentals. Terrific way to really age ourselves is to talk about the good old days of renting video games. Now, in some cases, renting a game could have led to eventually buying the game, and heck, maybe in some cases you rented a game so many times it would have been cheaper to have just bought the game to begin with, but either way, renting games can allow for experimentation. With just a few bucks on the line, and heck, a few bucks that probably belong to our parents, not us, we were much more likely to take risks on rentals as opposed to buying games. And you know, a lot of times the most popular games would already be rented out anyway, so you kind of had to force yourself to experiment a little bit. Something I've noticed a lot of collectors do is they will want to collect those games that they rented when they were younger, whether they liked the game or not, just because it has that certain special nostalgic attachment to them. And a lot of those games they certainly couldn't have bought back then for a variety of reasons. Of course, one of the biggest reasons being that a lot of us only had so many games back then, so just by default some games would get left behind. But another thing is that you couldn't always necessarily find certain games to purchase. Nowadays, we take it for granted that we can just go online and easily find any game we want to purchase. I mean, for the most part. But back then, you had to go hunt these games down at stores, and if it was a somewhat obscure game you had rented, it might not be that easy to find it to purchase it. Not to mention all the other usual shenanery that could happen that would make you not get a game that you wanted. For example, when it came to birthdays and you ask for certain games, you may not get those certain games. I know some of you may have had relatives where you ask for a certain video game and they get you a video game, but not the one you asked for. And then when you say, this is the wrong game, they go, whoa, I got you a video game, didn't I? I did my part. And then because we're kids and we're so hyper for games, we don't even give them a chance to return or exchange the game for the right one. We open that sucker up and play it right away. And then whatever game we had asked for before, well, opportunities were limited, and so that could have just been the game that got away. Plus, they still did get you a gift, and you don't want to seem ungrateful, so I could see some of us just being like, yeah, you know what, it's not the right game, but it is still a video game and I'm excited and I want to be appreciative of the fact that they got me a gift. And maybe they couldn't find the game that you did ask for. Is it really your aunt's fault she couldn't find Iggy's Wreckin' Balls? Then there's also the games that you never owned, but perhaps got to play in various social settings. Me personally, I was a younger brother of two older sisters who got dragged along to a lot of stuff that they did, and so I found myself in some weird situations. For example, I remember my older sister's soccer team had a pizza party, and I was there, and as you'd expect, there was pizza and there was a party. But what I was interested in was this Super Nintendo that they had hooked up with Donkey Kong Country, and it had just come out and it was all the rage, and you can bet that I wanted to get a turn playing some Donkey Kong Country on that thing. I didn't have a Super Nintendo growing up, making it all the sweeter to get to play that. So yeah, that game always has a special fondness with me just because of that memory of playing it for the first time. Plus, it wasn't even at somebody's house. It was at this Pizza Lodge place. Like I said, I ended up at some weird places back then. Of course, I own Donkey Kong Country nowadays because I'm guessing, like many of you, any game that I had fondness for back in the day, I now own. Although, I would be curious if any of you do have some games that you just never owned that you played back in the day that, of course, you do have some sort of attachment to. They're games that you maybe would like for one reason or the other. And that leads to this video's question, which is, what is that one game you played back in the day, but it has eluded you all this time and you never did get it? Or maybe you did eventually get it after a really long time, but if there's a game that has still eluded you even till this day, then all the more sweeter. Well, at least sweeter as far as being an interesting answer for us to all hear about. So leave those answers down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's